All right, everyone, get ready for this because today we are going deep on, Brexit. And specifically, this is going to be about the EU side of things. We found this really interesting YouTube video that analyzes how the EU reacted to Brexit strategically, you
Yeah.
know? And, well, I've got to say, some of the things this guy claims in the video are kind of surprising.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's one of those things where it's easy to get kind of, well, swept up in the whole emotional side of Brexit,
Yeah.
all the back and forth. But this video, it takes a step back and looks at it almost like a chess match. Like,
Right.
what were the EU's goals? What moves did they make to achieve those goals? And in the end, like, did their strategy work? Did they succeed?
It's like he's looking at the whole thing as like a game almost. So let's
Right.
try to break this whole strategic game down. So this video, the main argument is that the EU's goal, like their big overall goal, was basically just to show the world that leaving is hard. Like they wanted to discourage any other countries from trying to leave the bloc too.
Exactly. It's like around that time, when the UK was having their referendum, we were seeing all these terms being thrown around like uh, Frexit, France leaving, Grexit, Greece leaving. There's a real possibility that the EU was going to see like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Like one country leaves, and that inspires a bunch of others to consider it too.
Yeah, I remember that. It felt like for a while things were kind of teetering on the edge there, right? So how did the EU stop this? What did they do to counter that whole domino effect?
Well, the video, basically what it argues is that they took a very firm stance in the negotiations. Like their approach was basically take it or leave it. The message from the EU was basically we're not making this easy. And the video, it highlights that the EU is actually in a really good position to do this
Mm-hmm.
because of their size and their unity as a bloc.
Right, because the UK was on its own, but the EU had like, what was it, 27 other countries all
Yeah.
backing them up. But one thing that always comes up with the EU is their bureaucracy, right? Like uh, how much it slows things down. Didn't that hurt them?
It's interesting because the video actually argues the opposite. It says that because the EU has so much experience dealing with like really complex negotiations on an international level, you know, and even their bureaucracy, well, it actually turned out to be a good thing for them. They knew all the rules inside and out, and they could use that expertise to their advantage.
So it's like the EU was playing chess and the UK was playing checkers.
Yeah, that's actually a great way to put it. The video even has this example, like early on in the negotiations. The UK had to agree to a huge payment, like £35 billion. And, well, that kind of set the tone right. Like it really put the EU in a position of strength from the very beginning.
Wow. So the video is saying that overall the EU actually kind of came out ahead on this.
Well, not so fast. The video does say that, but it also acknowledges that Brexit wasn't all, good for the EU. Like there was some negative consequences for them too, economically.
Right, because they are trading partners after all. So there had to be at least some impact on the EU, right?
For sure. The video uses the example of the German car industry because they do a lot of business exporting to the UK, right?
Right.
So when Brexit happened, that definitely had an impact on them. So yeah, some sectors within the EU definitely felt it.
So, like, some people got hurt, but overall the EU was okay?
Well, that's kind of what the video seems to suggest. But we should take a look at some of the specifics, see just how bad or not bad it was for each side.
Yeah, and the video even mentions this statistic, to highlight that. The UK exports something like 42% of their goods to the EU, but the EU only exports about 9% to the UK. Like that's a big difference.
Oh yeah, for sure. It really shows how imbalanced things were, in terms of who needed whom more.
Totally.
But what I thought was really interesting, and this is something the video talks about too, it's this whole thing about how being part of the EU actually gave the UK this weird kind of scapegoat.
Oh yeah, I remember that part. That was a kind of light bulb moment for me. Like it's interesting how being in the EU actually let the UK blame the EU for stuff.
Exactly. So it was like whenever things weren't going great in the UK, like if the economy was bad or if there were those long wait times for the, what is it, the NHS, the National Health Service,
Right.
people could always just point the finger at Brussels,
Right.
They're like, oh, it's those EU regulations. It's their fault.
It was an easy way to kind of deflect blame, right?
Exactly.
But then now that they're out of the EU, well, now every problem has to be their own fault, right?
Yeah, like the dynamic is totally flipped. Now, any problem that pops up in the UK, people immediately look at it through the lens of Brexit. Like, is this because of Brexit?
Like it's the elephant in the room.
Right.
Even if it's not the only reason for a problem,
For sure.
it's hard to ignore that Brexit is at least part of the problem.
Yeah, and the video even uses the example of food shortages. So, like, Obviously, there are global factors that are affecting food supplies everywhere, right? Like the bad weather and the energy crisis, all that. But the thing is, the UK seems to be having a harder time with this than a lot of other countries.
Right. So even if Brexit isn't the only reason for those shortages, well, it's kind of hard to ignore it as a factor.
Yeah, totally.
Which kind of brings us to this other point the video makes about the, what was it, the consolation goal?
Oh, yeah. That's where he compares the whole thing to a soccer game, you know?
Yeah.
Like, if one team is winning 7-0, well, they can afford to let the other team score a goal near the end. It doesn't really change the outcome, but it makes the losing team feel a little better, you know?
Okay, I think I'm starting to see where this is going. So he's saying that the Windsor framework, that's the recent agreement between the UK and the EU, right?
Yeah.
To smooth over some of the trade issues. He's
Right.
saying that's kind of like a consolation goal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, it's a good thing, you know? It's definitely a step in the right direction, but it doesn't really change the fact that the UK is still out of the EU, and they're still dealing with all the consequences of that.
So it's like the big picture hasn't really changed.
Right.
And the video talks about this too.
The world is a very different place now than it was back when the UK voted to leave. Like, the war in Ukraine, that's a huge deal, right? And it's forced the UK and the EU to work together, you know, some really important issues.
Yeah.
Uh,
So could this whole consolation goal thing, could that be a sign that things are shifting? Like, is it possible that the UK and the EU are moving towards a more, I don't know, a more collaborative relationship?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Or is it just wishful thinking?
Yeah. I mean, the video doesn't give a clear answer on that. It's more like he wants us to think about these questions.
To kind of grapple with it ourselves, right?
Yeah, like look past the headlines
Mm.
and think about the long-term implications.
Because this isn't just some theoretical game, right? These are real people and real countries. It's like he's
Exact-
giving us all the pieces, but we have to figure out how the puzzle fits together ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a really important puzzle because, like you said, this isn't just some abstract idea, you know? This is affecting people's lives.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the video does a good job of reminding us of that. Like, it's not just about the politics, you know, or the economics. It's about real people.
Right. And the video even says that the EU, like, they don't actually want to see the UK fail, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because, like, a stable UK, that's good for everyone,
Yeah.
even if they're not part of the bloc anymore.
So it's kind of like, you know, you have that annoying neighbor, and maybe you're glad when they move away, but then you realize that you kind of miss them.
Uh-huh. Yeah, kind of like that.
But I mean, in all seriousness, the UK is having to deal with the reality of going it alone now, you know?
That's for sure.
It's not as easy as they thought it would be. So, like, both sides have a reason to try to work things out, right? But
Is the Windsor framework enough? Like, is that really going to bridge the gap between the UK and the EU?
well, that's a tough question. I mean, the video uses that analogy of the consolation goal, right? But could it be something more? Like, could it be the start of a real change in their relationship?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. It's hard to say for sure. I mean, the video points to a few things that could influence things, you know. Like, for example, the UK's internal politics. If they get a government that's, you know, really anti-EU, well, that's probably not going to help things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And on the EU side, well, I mean, some of those countries are probably still kind of sore about the whole thing. You know, they might not be in a hurry to give the UK any more favors.
Yeah, there's definitely baggage on both sides.
For sure.
But, you know, the video also reminds us that the world has changed a lot. Like with the war in Ukraine, the UK and the EU, they have to cooperate. Like they don't really have a choice.
Right.
And, you know, working together on something like that, maybe that could help them rebuild some trust. Maybe it could even lead to more cooperation in other areas.
So it sounds like, you know, the future of their relationship, it's still up in the air.
Yeah, pretty
This
much.
video, it's helped us understand how they got to this point.
The history, the strategy, all of that.
But the next chapter, well, we're going to have to wait and see how that plays out.
Yeah, it's like we're watching this high-stakes game, you know, and we don't know what the next move is going to be.
Well, it's a game worth watching, that's for sure. And hey, maybe we'll revisit this in a future deep dive, you know? See what's changed, see what new moves have been made.
Yeah, I'd be down for that.
All right. Well, until then, listeners, keep your eyes on the board. Because even a small move can change the whole game. And thanks for joining us on the deep dive.